Arriving at Burwood High School as a new principal this year, we thought it was really important that the whole school community has a focus on teaching and learning as our core business. So the first step in that was to develop a professional learning community with the entire staff. So that began with staff telling their professional journeys, exploring how they wanted to be treated, and then developing a charter on how we treat each other as a response to that. So after spending about a term developing the charter, it was then time to focus on the site improvement planning process. So we came up with the three main areas for improvement for our site that we negotiated with the entire school community. And then it was a matter of looking at, well, what are the major beacons on the hill that we're trying to achieve with each of those? So it was really unpacking what each of them meant and ensuring that everybody was on the same page with that. And one of the main goals with the site improvement planning was to actually get it down to being a workable document. So rather than spending months and months and then it sitting in my top drawer, we got it down to one page where it clarified what the beacons were. And from there we then started the emergent planning and then linking staff's learning plans to that. So the one we started to look at was raising achievement, which has been on our site improvement plan for some time. We ran a student-free day earlier in the year. We were focusing on one of our site improvement plan priorities, which was raising achievement. And we started by looking at some of the work from Professor Douglas Reeves, where he's looked at a number of schools that were highly disadvantaged, but were still achieving at a very high level. And what he found when he went into those schools was that it wasn't what the students brought to the table that made the difference, it was the teaching, that quality teaching matters, that we as teachers make a difference. So the focus of the first part of the student-free day was looking inward about what can we do to raise achievement as teachers. I guess as a leader it was really important not to discount some of the issues that students do bring with them. And also just as important not just to blame the teachers, but to say, look, we can make a big difference here as a teaching force. And if we look inward, then we can make a huge difference to these children's lives and raise achievement by our actions, not just by blaming them for what's gone wrong. So after quite a bit of discussion about the difference we can make as teachers, we then focused on the fact that we can't do everything. So there's lots of things out there that we can improve, but we don't have time to focus on everything. So if everything does work, what gives us the greatest leverage? So we looked at the work of Professor John Hattie in this, who's done a lot of work around the difference that teachers can make. And it was clear from his research that feedback and formative assessment, which has been rebadged now, I guess, as assessment for learning, gives you the greatest leverage. If you can do that properly, that will have the biggest impact on raising achievement. So that's where we're starting. So after adopting this as the first step in our emergent plan, we then spent some time unpacking what assessment for learning actually means and looking at what it means for us at Burwood High School. So we focused a lot on the work of Professor Dylan William, who's done a lot of work on formative assessment, and used some of his work to guide what we were doing.
To me, formative assessment describes all those processes by which teachers and learners use information about student achievement to make adjustments to the students' learning that improve their achievement. So it's about using the information to adapt your teaching and adapt the work of the students to put the learning back on track, if you like, to make sure that the learning is proceeding in the right direction and to support that learning. So it's what happens when you don't just lecture students and rattle through the material until you get to the end and ask them if they've understood it okay. It's constantly making those adjustments. One of the ways I like to talk about it is just imagine what would happen if a pilot flew like many teachers assess. So I flew back from Seattle a few weeks ago. Just imagine what the pilot would have done. He would have flown east for 9 hours, and then after 9 hours he'd say it's time to land. So he'll put the plane down and he'll ask, is this London? And of course, even if it's not London, he says, well, everybody's got to get off because I've got to get onto the next journey. And that's exactly the way that we've assessed in the past. We teach students material, and at the end of that teaching, we find out if they've learned it or not. And if they haven't, we say, too bad, because we're on to the next unit. So what formative assessment does is encourages teachers to take constant readings about where students are, just in the same way that a pilot takes constant readings about their position. And if the learning isn't proceeding as you'd planned, then you make adjustments. That's the essence, to me, of formative assessment. So the reason I think that formative assessment is the right focus is because assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. It's only through assessment of some kind that you know whether what has been taught has been learned. And that's why I think this focus on this assessment process, minute by minute and day by day, not at the end of a sequence of learning, minute and day by day, allows teachers to reflect on their practice and make small steps in improving that practice in a more powerful way than anything we've seen before. When we started working on formative assessment, or assessment for learning as it's sometimes called, we were focusing very much on feedback. So we started with feedback because that's where the research was most clearly organised. We then realised that unless you'd asked the right question, then feedback wasn't very useful. So questioning and feedback came into the equation together. As we worked with teachers to implement this in classrooms, we discovered you couldn't change what the teacher was doing without changing what the students were doing. And in particular, the importance of student self-assessment, what we sometimes call activating students as owners of their own learning, and peer assessment, or what we sometimes call activating students as teaching resources for one another, assumed much greater salience. Now, when we talk about peer assessment, a lot of people immediately assume we're just talking about having kids marking each other's work so that the teacher doesn't have to do it. And people always get the wrong idea, because that's summative peer assessment. What we have discovered is that formative peer assessment, where students are helping each other improve their work, has benefits for the person who receives feedback, but also has benefits for the person who gives the feedback. Because in thinking through what it is that this piece of work represents and what needs to happen to improve it, the students are forced to internalize the success criteria. And they're able to do it in the context of somebody else's work, which is less emotionally charged than your own. So what we see routinely now, we see it very, very commonly, is when students have given feedback to others about a piece of work, their own subsequent attempts at that same work are much improved, because they are now much clearer about what good work in that task looks like. So that's been, and I think one of the real breakthroughs is just the real benefit of peer and self-assessment, both for the person who is doing the assessment, self-assessment, and the person who's giving feedback, the peer assessment. We see students being very, very effective commentators on each other's work and giving very, very sound advice, sometimes a lot harder than the teacher would give. One of the things that you see quite routinely in classrooms is children being much tougher on each other than the teacher would dare to be, because of the emotional relationships and the power relationships there, but actually generally pretty much spot on.
Experience delivering professional development, I guess, has told me that teachers really need concrete exemplars and practical strategies if you're going to make a change to classroom practice. Not dissimilar to what the students need in our classes. It's really assessment for learning for the staff as well. So we started by looking at an example of a Year 11 English class where they were doing orals that were being podcast. The afternoon session then changed its focus. We spent the morning looking at teachers make the difference, what gives us the greatest leverage, and then unpacking what assessment for learning looks like in our classes. The critical point now is to change classroom practice. So we looked at what is it that we need to do now to change what happens in classrooms. And we looked then at our emergent plan and linking staff performance plans to that. So when you have a look at some of the work of Reeves, and again he says if you look at 150 people all go to the same workshop, why is it that only 6 or 7 times back in the classroom does that make an impact? And he says it's the level of implementation that's vital. So to get a deep level of implementation at a site, We came up with a rubric that said this is what assessment for learning would look like in our site if it's exemplary, and then assessing ourselves against that rubric. We then asked staff to look at their own learning plans, and we've changed them from performance management plans to learning plans, linked with the work that they're doing in their professional learning communities. And we've linked those back to the site improvement plan. So their learning plans now say, what does this look like in my classroom? So if raising achievements on our site improvement plan, the first step in our emergent plan is looking at assessment for learning. What does that look like in my classroom? And getting them to articulate that and put that on paper. We then, in their small professional learning communities, their learning teams, they've then said, okay, in the next 4 weeks I will. And so they'll commit to that team what they will trial. So we gave a lot of choice in that depending on people's level of confidence. So they could choose which class they wanted to do it with, which aspect of assessment for learning they would focus on first, how the review of that would be done, who would be giving them the feedback on how well that went. But we didn't give them the option to opt out and do nothing. And I think that was really important. As a whole school, we're focusing on assessment for learning, but there's choice within that. So staff then put that on their plan, their learning plan, and then 4 weeks later we re-meet in those learning teams to talk about how that went. So they're sharing the successes and failures of that. It's not uncommon for teachers to work together on planning a unit of work and doing their programming together. We wanted to take it beyond that. So in our learning teams, as well as sitting down together and giving them time to plan and do their programming, we've then given them release time to observe each other teaching that unit of work, so it takes it to the next level. They've also set common assessment tasks, and they'll mark those together. And then at the end of that, we'll do the sharing and the review before we then start the cycle again. It became evident fairly early on that when staff were sitting down to write their learning plans, that for some of them that was quite a threatening exercise. I guess in the past some of those things have been used for external accountability, and we wanted to be very clear this was about the responsibility for them to improve their teaching practice for their own benefit and for the benefit of their students, not some external accountability process. So I role modelled that for staff in 2 ways. I did a learning plan for myself as a maths teacher and shared that with them about what it looks like in my classroom, but I also did it as a leader, and for the student-free day I had some peers come to watch me perform on the student-free day, and they gave me some very harsh feedback on how I could have improved, which is great, and I was able to demonstrate for staff how that's made me a better leader. I gained feedback from them on the day, so in effect they were my students, so I've got student feedback, and so I've included that in the plan. And so in my plan it had what I intended to achieve in that 4-week period, the feedback from my peers, the feedback from my students, and then my self-evaluation. So I linked in there what it was that I'll continue to do, what it is that I'll stop doing, and what I'll start doing as a result of that feedback. But I thought it was vital to model that with staff as they were finding it quite difficult to get started with that. When we started this, one of the things that became obvious from our emergent planning was that there's not enough time to do the sharing, the observations, the planning. So we needed to create that time without creating more work for teachers. So in discussions with my curriculum leaders, we've agreed that faculty meetings will no longer exist at our site, and that the information that was given during those times is being done in a different way. What that's allowed us to do is it's freed up 6 staff meetings per term, where we can now have learning team meetings. What we've done with those 6 is because you can't share every couple of weeks because you wouldn't have had time to implement stuff. So we're spending 2 of those 6 on T&D, around assessment for learning within their learning teams. 2 of them are where we decide what is it we're going to do for the next 4 weeks and sharing how the last 4 weeks went. And then 2 of those is actually sitting down and doing some joint planning or some joint marking. So we've now got 6 learning team meetings per term, so it's giving staff the time to do that properly. When I was first exposed to the research from Dr. John Hattie, My first reaction to feedback being the highest on the list was, well, I already do that. I'm already doing formative assessment, so obviously I'm doing it right. I guess I had a real aha moment for myself when I started looking at the work of Dylan William around what assessment for learning is and how that's different to formative assessment, which often is just summative assessment, but we don't count the marks. And so for me, doing the rubric in this detail has been what's made the huge difference. Really articulating what it means to be proficient and exemplary at things like peer assessment and self-assessment and the difference that makes for children versus just thinking that I'm doing assessment for learning. And I had the same reaction from staff that when we first broached this, quite a few said, oh, I'm already doing that. And they were. But it's the depth at which they're doing it that's important, and we need to be doing it right across the board, minute by minute and day by day, which is one of Dylan Williams' quotes, to make a real difference in classrooms. One of the things that I think is critical in an educational leader today is to be a role model for staff, what you're expecting staff to be doing. And I've tried very hard to do that. And I don't mind role modelling mistake making either, because I've done plenty of that. But it's good for staff to see that and a sense of moving forward. I don't mind being a messy leader either, so partway through the emergent plan when something's not working, to shift that sideways and to go in a different direction. And there's been plenty of evidence of that. So at the end of the day, for me, it's about making teaching and learning the central focus of the school. And as a principal, it's me being the leader of learning with my staff.